Welcome to this installment of the Asia program and the China Center's series of talks on contemporary issues in Asia. Today we have with us Scott Moore, the author of the new book, China's Next Act, which he'll be talking with us about today. The full title is China's Next Act, How Sustainability and Technology Are Reshaping China's Rise and the World's Future. Scott is a valued colleague of mine here at Penn, in addition to writing that book and another book, Subnational Hydropolitics, which came out a few years ago. His work appears in China Quarterly, Foreign Affairs, New York Times, Nature, and other journals. These days, he is the director of the China Program and Strategic Initiatives at Penn Global, where he oversees the Global Research and Engagement Program and leads strategic initiatives for the Vice Provost for Global Initiatives at Penn. He also teaches topics and courses in Chinese politics here, and in his spare time manages to crank out this kind of scholarship as well. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Scott here. Let me just set up a couple of ground rules for the session that will be happening. For those of you who join us frequently, you know the drill, which is Scott gets half an hour plus a bit to lay out the arguments and the content of his books. If you want to participate in the conversation, please put your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat function. And we will get to those in due course. We'll weave them into our conversation. So without further ado, let me just say two more things, which are that these programs, which we are delighted that you join us for, whether they're on Zoom, which they have been lately, or in person, which we hope to be going back to soon, especially with FPRI's new offices. They're free to you, but they're not free to us, so we'd be grateful if you would join FPRI or donate to FPRI. And one more item to plug is that the Penn Project on the Future of U.S.-China Relations, of which FPRI's Asia program is a co-sponsor, will be doing a public session 2 weeks from today at 12:30 at Perry World House. A bunch of folks that you've seen in our sessions will be here, including Scott. Will be there for at least part of the day, but there will be a public session again from 12:30 to 2 at Perry World House on the Penn campus. So I've taken up way too much time, including with the glitch not unmuting at the start. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Scott Moore.
Thanks so much, Jacques, and thanks so much to the Asia program and the China Center at FPRI. It's always a particular pleasure to have this kind of get to speak to hometown audiences, though thanks to the pandemic, I'm cognizant that many may be joining from well outside Philadelphia, which is also of course, a real pleasure. So I'm a big fan of giving folks the bottom line up front. And so here it is with respect to my new book, China's Next Act. We should really be thinking about China's rise, U.S.-China relations, and engagement with China more generally, principally in terms of two areas that we haven't thought as much about in the past. And those two are sustainability, which includes public health and pandemic prevention, as well as climate change and other environmental issues, and emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and biotechnology. And the reason I think it's so important that we focus our thinking and our action and our policy about China and China's rise in the world is both because our future is increasingly clouded by major challenges, both in the fields of sustainability and emerging technology, but also because developments in those two areas are reshaping a lot of the more traditional areas of focus in U.S.-China relations and in China's relationship with the world at large. Some examples and things we'll talk more about are issues and tensions over Taiwan, for example. It's very hard to speak about those without at least mentioning semiconductors, but there are many other examples. And of course, I'll say more about that in the slides to come. Let me first back up, though, and say a little bit more about why I wrote this book. And it really has to do with an experience that I had about a decade ago, and I had the chance through a fellowship to spend some time at the U.S. Department of State on the China desk, the office that handles U.S.-China relations, with a portfolio or a job responsibility called Environment, Science, Technology, and Health. I had just come out of graduate school and doing a postdoc And so especially coming from academia where, as you all know, the focus is really on relentless specialization and being handed a job that had all of these different areas combined in it, seemed somewhere between laughable and maybe even downright dangerous to expect one single person to kind of keep track of and handle all of these very different areas, everything from climate change to satellite orbits to nuclear waste. But over the period that I was there, that kind of set of responsibilities became a little bit less of an eccentricity, which is how it first appeared to me. As a lot of these issues, and in particular climate change, became really central to U.S.-China relations. I happened to be there in the year leading up to the Paris Agreement on climate change in 2015. And in that period, climate change rocketed from an important but still somewhat peripheral issue in U.S.-China relations to one of, if not the most important issue in U.S.-China relations. And it was so important that I found myself, and here's where the picture that you see there comes into play, being basically drafted into attending the Paris Agreement talks, really just to keep track of the sheer number of meetings that were taking place between U.S. and Chinese officials as part of the agreement. Many of those meetings were very high level. The gentleman that you see with his hand sort of awkwardly on my shoulder there is then Secretary of State John Kerry. I should maybe fess up to the context of this photo, which is that shortly before this photo was taken, I'd been casually reading the newspaper that you see me holding there when the secretary came into our office there, came right over to me and said something to the effect of, "I thought you all were supposed to be working," which accounts for some of the nervous laughter that you see there too. But the point is that I was there really because of the intensity of very high-level diplomacy going on between the U.S. and China, and just how important climate change became to U.S.-China relations. And I hasten to add that climate change wasn't the only example of sort of newer or non-traditional areas where there seemed to be so much promise for U.S.-China relations. Another was public health, and this moment in 2015 was preceded by what was at the time thought to be a very successful example of U.S.-China cooperation in response to a serious outbreak of Ebola in West Africa in 2014-2015. And what this all added up to was a real sense that I shared, and I think many of my colleagues at least the State Department shared at the time, which was that not only were the United States and China capable of working together to address shared global challenges in the realm of environmental sustainability, but also that doing that might allow us to lay the foundation for a more constructive relationship going forward. And it's worth kind of briefly noting that even at that time, U.S.-China relations were pretty rocky. Climate change was a real exception, and public health was a real exception. And we really felt that by working together on those issues, we could make some progress, not just on those issues themselves, but also the broader relationship and China's role in the world. Well, we all know how that turned out over the last decade or so, and that vision more or less failed, at least for now. And that leads me to the goals that I set out for this book. First of all, to just try to tie together and present a picture of what China's role actually looks like in tackling these shared global challenges, both in sustainability and emerging technology, to at least offer a couple of explanations for why this vision that so many of us shared and this promise that seemed so great has largely failed, especially in preventing or addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. And third and finally, but most importantly, to try to think of some ways how we can make progress despite the growing tension and rivalry between the US, China, and other countries. Just to kind of briefly lay out, there are four things that you're going to hear me talk about in this presentation and that I talk about a little bit more at length in the book. and I want to briefly go through them. I've already talked about shared ecological challenges and emerging technologies as being sort of the key issues that I address in the book. And the reason that I think those are really important to look at alongside each other is that developments in those two areas are really reshaping so much of the global future, as well as key elements of U.S.-China relations, China's relationship with other countries as well. And I also talk about these two concepts of competition and cooperation, especially when we think about those shared ecological challenges. We tend to think about those as things that require cooperation. You can't address climate change without cooperation between the U.S. and China. On the other hand, emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, we often think about development of those technologies as being sort of a competition, or at least involving some degree of competition between the US, China, and other major countries. But actually, I think it's important to kind of break down those definitions. And in fact, there are ways in which competition can be helpful in addressing issues like climate change, while on the other hand, we do need a lot of cooperation when it comes to dealing with emerging technologies. So really what I try to do in the book is weave through an understanding of how both shared ecological challenges and emerging technologies relate to these concepts of competition and cooperation that we talk so much about when it comes to China. And just to say that I try to fill in the gaps there. A concept that I developed throughout the book that I think is helpful for thinking about all of these issues in relation to each other is called the risk society. And that's a concept that a German sociologist named Ulrich Beck came up with back in the 1980s. He enjoyed sort of a brief period of pseudo-celebrity in the early phases of the pandemic, when folks like Adam Tooze, a well-known historian and public intellectual, publicized some of his writing. But the key thing about Beck and this concept of the risk society is that he argued that increasingly societies are shaped and defined by existential risks, especially those that emanate from environmental or ecological changes, and that those tend to be very threatening and very destabilizing, not only for societies, but also politics. It's very difficult for governments to address these existential risks, and that tends to have a very complex and often a very negative effect on societies, politics, and economics. And I think that's a really useful way to think about some of how Chinese society has developed over the last few years, especially as it begins to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's worth underscoring, though we've seen a lot of depictions of this in the media, that while the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted life everywhere, it almost certainly has not disrupted life anywhere as much as China, with possibly the exception of some extreme cases like North Korea. It's hard to overstate the cumulative effect of lockdowns, the increasing prevalence of surveillance and tracking that was instituted during the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course the knock-on effects with respect to economic growth, trade, lots of other things from the COVID-19 pandemic fundamentally reshaped Chinese society and its economy. But it's also the case that other ecological risks have increasingly reshaped China's economy and its politics, arguably just as much. And that's certainly true of climate change. The photo that I show here on the right is from the summer of 2021. That was the second consecutive summer that China was subject to record-breaking droughts. Record-breaking floods that resulted, among other things, in this photo from the Zhengzhou subway, an incident in which about 500 people were trapped underground and a few dozen people tragically died. I could just as easily have shown a photo from just this past summer in which much of the same part of central China was subjected not to record-breaking floods, but record-breaking droughts that were so severe that they caused most economists to downgrade China's growth prospects for the year on top of COVID-related disruptions. So again, increasingly the case that we're seeing ecological factors and developments in the ecological sphere really reshape a lot of China's politics, its economics, and its society. That's also true, though, not just of ecological risks, but also technological risks. This photo is of someone who is generally not very well known, and yet I think you could make the argument may have changed the human condition as much as anyone in centuries, if not longer. His name is He Jiankui. He is a Chinese physicist turned geneticist who in 2018, and that's where this photo was taken at an international genomics conference, announced to a stunned scientific community that he had artificially edited the genomes of two human fetuses in embryo that were subsequently brought to term, making them, as far as anyone knows, the world's first deliberately genetically engineered humans. Now, it's worth pointing out, and this is something I go into in some more detail in the book, that biotechnology has been an area of intense focus for China's policymakers, including for developments in just these kinds of biomedical fields. Yet far from being a success for the development of China's, a key part of China's tech sector, this actually proved to be an enormous disaster for China's scientific community, and for its reputation in the world. To make a long story short, He was eventually imprisoned and thoroughly discredited, and his achievement, such as it was, actually resulted in a wholesale reform of the way that China conducts, funds, oversees scientific research, especially in the biomedical arena. It's hard to overstate the impact that this case had on China's biomedical and biotechnological communities. Again, I think a stark example of how technological risk as well as ecological risk is increasingly reshaping key swaths of contemporary China. But meanwhile, and something I go into in quite a bit of detail in the book, is that these newer ecological and technological risks are overlaid on older and more traditional challenges that China and its leadership are facing. We all know that coming out of the pandemic, China emerges as economically weakened, but that doesn't even really begin to capture the macroeconomic challenges that China faced even before the pandemic. China's navigating a very tricky macroeconomic transition from middle to high income country status. And it's worth pointing out that for all China's growth and development over the better part of 50 years, it remains relatively poor when measured on a per capita gross national income and purchasing power parity adjusted basis, which is what you see in the figure there at left. It's also worth pointing out that the driver of China's economic growth through this period, and it is an enormously impressive record of growth, but has been exports. And the share of exports as a percentage of Chinese GDP, though, began to fall really right around the period following the financial crisis in 2008, and has yet to recover. And while part of this transition is healthy, as you grow and develop an economy, you want growth to be driven by several things, not just exports, but also consumer spending. But the fact is that China has never satisfactorily managed to plug the hole that the fall off in exports played in its growth trajectory and growth pattern. And that is a problem that's becoming increasingly apparent, again, as China emerges from the COVID-19 pandemic and faces a really fundamentally reordered pattern of supply and demand that anyone in the business community will be very familiar with. It's also worth pointing out that this transition, this economic transition that China is facing and going through, has historically and in other countries been associated with acute political challenges. One of the things that's very striking, if you look at income versus measures of democratic accountability, for example, what you see is that China is really an outlier. in terms of having very, very low measures of democratic accountability, where most upper, middle, and high income countries have significantly higher measures. And of those, there are some very significant cases like South Korea or Taiwan that, as part of their transition through this middle to high income country barrier, essentially, experience significant political change. Now, I don't present this to predict that China will experience dramatic political change, but what I do argue that it signals is the likelihood of some pretty severe political pressures on China's ruling Communist Party that emanate from this combination of macroeconomic challenges, ecological and technological risks. And I would argue that we saw an example of that, though a nuanced one, in the protests that shook China just a few weeks ago. And we can certainly talk more about that. Another key thing that I found in my research for the book is that although we often think about, and I mentioned this briefly at the outset, issues like climate change as things we really need cooperation to address, as a practical matter, it's almost always been the case that politics and geopolitics shape countries' responses to ecological as well as technological challenges. And I think the pandemic really highlights this in stark relief, as well as the core dilemma that I try to explore in the book, and that I think the case of China confronts us with, which is that we do have these ecological and technological challenges that are fundamentally shared. And yet political and geopolitical tensions and rivalries really create some profound barriers to making progress on those shared objectives. So one of the really striking things about the COVID-19 pandemic is that it's the second novel coronavirus just in this century, in the 21st century, to originate, as far as we know, in a pretty narrow band within a couple hundred kilometers of each other in southern China. Now, I hasten to add that there are several regions around the world that appear to be more likely than others to give rise to new viral diseases, big swaths of the Americas, Africa, other parts of Asia. But what distinguishes parts of southern China from these other potential pandemic hotspots, as they're known, is that it's extremely well connected to the rest of the world. And you can see that by looking at least pre-pandemic levels of passenger traffic, in which you see an unprecedented concentration of two of the world's largest airports in southern China. A stark example, I think, if there ever was one, of how the world needs China to address and prevent pandemics, including future pandemics. And yet we all know how the response to the COVID-19 pandemic turned out. And it's worth maybe just mentioning that part of what I discovered in my research is that, in fact, public health and specifically pandemic prevention has long been one of the greatest substantive focus areas for U.S.-China governmental cooperation, maybe the single biggest area of cooperation. And yet, for a variety of reasons, that investment proved completely inadequate in the face of growing geopolitical tension, rivalry, and poor leadership on both sides. And I think that's a sobering conclusion when it comes to relying on this idea of cooperation to navigate shared challenges. So if we can't necessarily depend on cooperation to address these shared challenges, what's next? Well, one of the ideas I develop and explore in the book is the idea that under certain circumstances, competition, both geopolitical, economic, ideological, might in some cases be good and help advance addressing issues like climate change. One example that I think is a pretty clear one of this potential and this promise is the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. Which is to date, and if fully implemented and projections prove not too wide of the mark, will be the most significant policy tool that the U.S. has to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And it should result in a reduction of somewhere between 35 and 40% greenhouse gas emissions by around 2030. That is a really significant reduction, by far the most significant that we've seen coming out of the United States. The key thing about this from a China perspective is that in his message to Congress saying, if you pass this bill, I will sign it, President Biden specifically referred to the need for this bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, to help the United States compete more effectively with China. A pretty clear example, I think, of the way in which, at least from a political perspective, there is considerable value in pursuing climate action, in part as a way to compete economically, geopolitically, and otherwise. I'm going to go ahead and skip through a couple of slides here, just in the interest of moving us toward discussion. But I do want to pause on one final key message that came through to me in researching and writing this book, and that I want to make sure to emphasize in terms of if our response to shared ecological and technological challenges has to be about competition. How do we compete effectively, and how do we win? And one thing that became very, very clear to me is that whether we're talking about geopolitical competition, military competition, economic competition, at the end of the day, the most important assets and advantages are intangible ones. There are things like data, norms and standards, governance frameworks, and above all, people and human capital. And I think that's a really important message to emphasize, because when we think about competition, especially of the geopolitical or military variety, we tend to think that that means primarily big, tangible, physical things, more aircraft carriers, better roads, ports, bridges, when in fact, I think that competition is more about intangibles than anything else. And again, it's above all about human capital. One poignant example of this, I think, is the gentleman that you see in the photo there, whose name is Qian Xuesun. Qian came to the United States in the mid-1930s. He was born in Hangzhou, eventually ended up at Caltech, where he played a really key role in founding what became the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. For any space nerds out there, they're the folks that today build the Mars rovers. But as the name implies, a lot of their original research was devoted to the development of jet engine technology. And Qian proved to be such an important part in the development of that key technology, and really, in many ways, such a singular genius, that after the Second World War, when the United States and its allies captured some leading German scientists and brought them back to the United States to help develop what eventually became the US space program, no native-born American had the proper expertise to question them. And so Qian was stunningly, in my view, temporarily made a lieutenant colonel in the US Army, just so that he could question these leading German scientists, which nobody else had the right expertise to question. And again, that's the photo that you see here of him in uniform. A little bit later in the 1950s, though, during the McCarthy era, Qian was accused of harboring some secret communist sympathies, and he was eventually deported back to China, where he promptly played a similarly key role in developing China's space and nuclear programs. It's a really striking example to me of how the human capital and skills and knowledge embodied really just in a single individual can almost single-handedly shift the balance of power between countries. And I saw several other examples of that in the course of my research that underscored again to me the importance of human capital and talent when it comes to effective competition, economically, geopolitically, or otherwise. I want to just, in conclusion, say that although I focus a lot in the book and certainly have talked a lot in this short talk about competition, I do think it's really important that there also be space for cooperation, both between the US and Chinese governments, but also private enterprise, universities, other non-state actors. And there are three particular strategies or approaches that my research showed, I think makes that cooperation or that engagement most effective. One is an approach I call ring fencing, and that's basically where leaders on both sides have the stature to essentially agree to try to insulate a particular issue area from broader tensions or politics. One example of that I came across in the book is the area of nuclear security, which is trying to secure certain nuclear radiological material, prevent it from being used for any kind of nefarious purpose. And that's an area in which the US and China actually have quite a good track record of cooperation. It's not perfect. And I think one of the reasons why it's been relatively successful is that it's more or less flown under the radar, very technical issue that's handled by a very small number of people, but it's essentially managed to avoid becoming politicized, as unfortunately climate change and so many other issues have been. So I think ring fencing is one way to preserve some space for US-China cooperation, but it's probably a strategy that's not going to be effective unless it's a pretty narrow, highly focused, highly technical issue. The other approach is to form broad and flexible coalitions of like-minded countries. And this is something that the Biden administration has given a lot of emphasis to. I think they're right to. I also talk in the book about how I think it's easier said than done, though, especially given that forming those effective coalitions that ideally would include China would also require getting a really broad swath of countries like Mexico, Brazil, India on board. And that sheer diversity makes it really difficult. And the reason I think you need those broad coalitions is that when it comes to these global challenges, whether it's climate change or data governance, artificial intelligence, it's just simply the case that it can't be just the US, China, and the EU. It also has to be countries and powers like India, and that does introduce additional complexity. And the third and final approach, which I think we probably don't make as much use of, is to actually exploit advantages that the US and advanced industrial democracies continue to have in key areas like semiconductors and in biotechnology, where for the most part, the democratic economies remain in the lead and have considerable advantages over their Chinese competitors. Now, to date, the main approach on the part of the US government and many of its allies has been to use that advantage or that asymmetry to enforce restrictions. And really to try to penalize and hold back China's progress in key technological areas. I would argue that that also creates an opportunity, and a more productive one, to try to engage in a better, closer dialogue and use that leverage as a way to try to compel Chinese firms to adhere to international norms and standards. Granted, that's going to be easier in some areas than others. But I think it's an approach that has been underutilized and that I think we should make more of going forward. I am going to go ahead and stop there, and hopefully we will have a good amount of time for some discussion. And thanks again to you all for joining.
Well, thank you, Scott, and thanks for that terrific overview of a book that I really do commend to people. It's an excellent read on a wide range of obviously quite timely and important topics. And I do encourage everyone out there to put their questions in the Q&A function, and we'll get to those. I just want to pick up on a couple of strands in what you've been addressing. So if we look at what's happened sort of since the book was locked down for publication and since it's come out, one could point to a couple of things that don't look all that hopeful. And one is what we've seen is, I think, an extension of the way you described the Biden administration's policies. It's sort of gone farther, right? We have the restriction on technology exports to China, particularly the semiconductor sector. And we see essentially this attempt both to restrict what goes to China and to essentially, to some degree, mirror Chinese behavior. I mean, the U.S. supposedly doesn't do industrial policy, but there are a lot of things that in the CHIPS Act and the Chips and Science Act and some built into the IRA and things like that, where basically we're trying to mirror images. So does that affect your conclusions in any way, sort of your sense of where we're likely headed on this?
Well, I think at a broad level, I do kind of anticipate and agree with, to some degree, this range of tools. I mean, I think one implication of this idea that you kind of have to face facts that even though we're living in this world that's shaped by increasingly shared challenges, as well as very divergent views of where we should go on key kind of value related issues. One implication of that is that you just can't depend on cooperation per se, and that we are going to have to compete to some degree. And there are certainly issue areas where I think that competition is well warranted. I talk in the book a little bit about telecoms, where I do think there are legitimate concerns for free expression, that if the area of advanced telecoms and 5G is essentially conceded to Chinese firms, there are real legitimate concerns there. But what I think is equally important to recognize, and something I do try to push in the book, is the idea that we need to preserve the space for a range of strategies, both cooperation and competition. And here's where I think the trend, especially in the US, but increasingly so elsewhere, is really to lock in, as you put it, Jacques, this view of China as an implacable adversary. Now, I do think there are very serious challenges that US policy, the foreign policy of other countries, have to contend with when it comes to China. I don't think it's particularly wise to lock in this view of China as an adversary. And again, in particular, I think there are opportunities that have so far gone almost entirely unutilized to get China, and it's more of a case of compelling and cajoling rather than hoping for old-fashioned agreement for China to abide by international standards in certain areas like bioethics, for example, or again, biosecurity, biosafety, and nuclear security. I think there are these areas where there is good prospect for cooperation that we haven't pursued and are kind of blind to because of this macro view that we have of China as an implacable adversary. And I would also add, I try to emphasize in the book that I think we need to be paying a lot more attention to the non-state kind of sector. When we talk particularly about US-China relations, we tend to automatically think about the governments interacting. But in fact, China's relationship with the US and other countries is very broad, very multifaceted, very diverse, and encompasses a huge range of actors, not just companies, but also universities and civil society. And I think once you appreciate that diversity, you start to see how it's simply not the case that every Chinese counterpart or potential interlocutor is as problematic as certain elements of the state or the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, that raises one of the questions about trends within China. You talked about the political system, I guess one can call it, in China, and it's sort of facing perhaps some hard times ahead. But one of the narratives of recent years has been that the room for action that's independent of state and party supervision and control has sort of shrunk. I mean, we've seen certainly some of the biggest bold-faced names in the sectors you talk about in tech, and talk about Jack Ma, we can talk about any number of others. They are in a sense more reined in than they used to be, and that has fed concerns in the US that Chinese tech companies are in some ways beholden to, or at least vulnerable to the government. We've seen to the party state. We've seen the TikTok bans. We've seen all that sort of concern. So, but this is a pendulum that, as you suggest, tends to swing back and forth a little bit. There's just a story in the paper this morning about how the business-friendly mode may be back as China tries to get the economy back on track after the COVID disruptions. So, do you have a sense of where that's heading, and how much the expanding reach and tightening grip, as it were, of the party state under Xi is an impediment to the kind of outside the party state or state structure cooperation you're talking about?
Well, undoubtedly, it's the case that the party's grip on kind of the non-state sector, so to speak, has tightened dramatically since the pandemic period, and certainly had started to well before that as well. My argument would be is that they're nonetheless, the kind of common, the next step in logic tends to be, and so any Chinese firm that you encounter, any, organization almost of any kind, is going to be joined at the hip with the party state. And that is just simply not true. And that is especially not true in tech. Where, as you pointed out, the party state apparently decided 3 or 4 years ago that the tech sector was in fact a threat to its rule, and decided to crack down. And even as a practical operational matter, one of the things I look at in the book are cases where the authorities in the party state lean on tech firms to censor content, to engage in sort of different types of surveillance. They're often resisted by tech firms because it's not in their interest to do so. So it's simply not true that all of these entities are joined at the hip, as is often the gloss. And I think what we should be thinking about as an extension of that is, okay, how do we exploit those differences, those divisions? Admittedly, I don't think the potential is there to, change anything fundamental about China's political system. But again, when it comes to thinking about adherence to basic international norms and standards that would really benefit the rest of the world economically in terms of facilitating technological integration, but also advancing norms related to free speech and other values that we should care a lot about, we should be making more of those divisions and those tensions. And I think right now we just ignore them for the sake of simplicity. And again, under this sort of banner of essentially everything about China is bad. I don't contest that to say that there isn't much about contemporary China that is objectively bad. But thinking about China in terms of these shared challenges, which after all we do face, just demands that we think about this in a less simplistic and more nuanced way.
So in your presentation in the book, you have a couple of striking examples, right? He Jiankui and Qian Xuesan. And in a sense, they're sort of paradigms for the two things you're talking about, right? One person, He, the gene splicer, who clearly isn't socialized into the norms of the international scientific community, and in a way a big advance, but in another way a crisis and a catastrophe. And then Qian Xuesan, who is, at least at the first part of the story, this great example of international mobility of this kind of intellectual capital, and engages with the U.S. only to face some pushback later. Well, your current job now is at a university, dealing with a lot of its international context. So where are we on that now? I mean, you could read in the media a lot of very different stories that run the gamut, as you suggest, from every Chinese a spy to we are cutting off this mode of connection, which allows the kind of exchange of ideas that moves forward science, that takes out of the mix some of the highly political demonization rhetoric that you're talking about. So what are you seeing on that front, and how hopeful or pessimistic are you on the trajectory ahead?
Well, let me kind of first say that I've sort of focused a little bit in my responses to your questions on what I think are some of the missed opportunities and shortcomings of our policy, especially in the U.S. But it does have to be said that the shambolic state of things, whether it's academic research collaborations or just sort of U.S.-China exchange relations more generally, certainly is also due to decisions taken by the party and by organizations within China, which do entail and involve a lot of restrictions on what, in the case of universities, what faculty can publish, what meetings they can attend, what they can say and present when they do so. So it's certainly the case that there is, plenty of fault to go around on both sides. And I think there are things on the Chinese side that do have to change before we get back to something well, I hesitate to use anything the phrase normal, but to the state that we would like to see, which is a vibrant exchange economically, intellectually, and otherwise between the U.S., China, and other countries. So I don't want to let that side of the equation pass without mention. I think the other part of answering your question, though, is it's too soon to tell. We're in just a couple days after the expiration of China's sort of hard quarantine rules. So we'll see. We'll see how quickly and completely exchange picks up between China and the U.S. in the academic and other spheres. I expect, it'll certainly take some time. We'll certainly, I think, expect to see a period where we're sort of waiting for this wave of infections to die down. And then we'll see. I think it probably will be a slow recovery. We may not ever get quite back to pre-pandemic levels. But I certainly hope that there will be some positive momentum in that direction. Again, though, I think it'll depend, at least in part, on how much openness foreign scholars, students, visitors of other kinds find when in fact they are able to return to China.
So I think you rightly point to tough economic times and, at least in the near term, a reluctance to consider significant political change. And so the question is, what goes forward in this sector? And I think you've hinted at some of this. It makes sense, it would seem, for an aging population and a sort of plateauing of the growth you get out of manufacturing things to continue to invest in technology sectors to try to move China more to the forefront there. That seems to be the growth areas. We've already seen a kind of interesting turn on public health, taking some big risks to try to get the economy going again, and so on. So we have a question in the chat about some of the sectors you haven't touched on yet. And one is about artificial intelligence. Is there anything distinctive to that sector? Where is China relative to the US? Does it present different dynamics for the competition cooperation structure you're talking about?
So AI is probably the best example of how technology has become dominated by this idea of competition. And that's the case both economically as well as geopolitically. One thing that an idea and a key kind of aspect of AI that I try to develop in the book is that there actually isn't anything about the technology that is that necessarily entails competition. And that's actually somewhat in contrast to semiconductors, for example. AI, there are a lot of aspects of AI development that are fundamentally pretty open source, or at least pretty democratic, in the sense that there are low barriers to entry. That's almost the opposite of semiconductors, where it's an extremely capital intensive, highly knowledge intensive industry and sector in which there are enormously high barriers to entry. And you see that in the relative progress of AI development and deployment in China versus semiconductors, which China really lags in most respects, despite decades worth of very heavy investment. Nonetheless, AI has sort of become this poster child for this idea of competition. At a broad level, there's not much to suggest that in a meaningful sense, Chinese firms or the Chinese state are really outstripping the US or other countries when it comes to AI development or deployment, with one asterisk, and that has to do with data. And I have a whole chapter on data. It's really the fuel that powers the digital economy, and that certainly powers the emerging tech sector. And one advantage that China does have is around data aggregation. And that's partly because of, looser sort of guardrails between data collected by the, sort of state or public sector and the private sector. But it's also partly thanks to the prevalence of WeChat, which, because it serves so many purposes, just enables the aggregation of data on a lot of different facets of consumer behavior. The last piece of that, though, is that it's not clear how much of an advantage that may be for Chinese companies or for the Chinese state, because when it comes to data, It's about quality as well as quantity. And it's not clear that the quality of data that's hoovered up by China's state apparatus or through apps like WeChat really confers as many direct advantages as it might seem at first.
So it raises a bit of a question about the ring fencing strategies that you suggest. And the cynic would say there's a lot less in the way of a lawn that you can ring fence these ways, right? We've seen the steady securitization of virtually all these issues. I mean, you dial the clock back a little ways, and the economic relationship was seen broadly as the ballast, the good part, and we could hopefully have that extend to a somewhat more fraught political realm and build from there. And then the sense of unfair competition broadly became this area of total national strength, including national economic security. And now we've got all of these, as you point out, sort of data-based technology industries where we're seeing that in securitized terms and telecommunications as well, with Huawei and the data capture there, WeChat, the bans on TikTok by use by state governments and so on. Not looking like a great trajectory on that front. So where are the areas that you see as most promising for ring fencing? The nuclear one is of course vitally important and a great example, but where else can we look to find prospects for creating those oases in the desert, which I think the one point the Chinese say don't exist, right, in the politics of bilateral relations?
Yeah. So, and admittedly, I think it is a narrow slice of issues where that's truly promising. Another one that I talk about in the book is wildlife conservation, and in particular, combating wildlife trafficking. I mean, no guarantees that issues won't become politicized, but I have trouble seeing the value, at least on the U.S. side, of trying to politicize that. And that's an area in which China has really shifted quite a bit during the pandemic period. Wildlife products, major industry historically in China for use in Chinese traditional medicine, especially. And so there was always a lot of difficulty in persuading Chinese government to ban the trade or import of certain wildlife products. As a result of the pandemic, though, and especially the original suspicion that it was that COVID-19 was spread by wild animals in the notorious Wuhan market, in particular, there was a more or less total ban was instituted, and just other kind of shifts during the pandemic have depressed demand for wildlife products, and so I think that's a promising area to engage in that one would hope. You could pretty much insulate from political rivalry, geopolitical rivalry, and political tension.
So one of the other things that's happened in the space you look at in the book, the spaces you look at in the book since it came out, is COP27, the climate change conference of parties meeting in Egypt just recently, and been some interesting developments there. China took a bit more criticism than we've seen before. We've talked about the loss and damage recovery. So what do you see as the developments coming out of the latest developments, the latest changes in the UNFCCC structure that would affect some of the issues you're talking about?
Yeah, and I think it tentatively created another example of where competition, especially geopolitical competition, might help produce some positive developments when it comes to climate change. So, just broad strokes, what happened at this climate conference is that really for the first time, other developing countries singled out China. At least in some cases. In other cases, it was sort of China plus India and other wealthier developing countries, and basically said, look, you guys are in another league economically and in terms of the amount of money you have, and you should be channeling much more to help us poorer developing countries adapt to climate change and deal with the effects of climate change. And this especially came into play with respect to an issue called loss and damage, which is really the idea of specifically compensating countries that are most heavily impacted by climate change. And so this was really the first time that you saw China get a lot of heat from other developing countries. Historically, China had been pretty tightly bound to the developing country bloc in the climate talks. So this is a pretty significant development. But what the kind of end result of this climate conference was, the most significant outcome was agreement to create a specific fund for loss and damage to which the most vulnerable, highly affected countries could apply. Now, China did not pledge to contribute anything to that, but the creation of that fund itself is a really significant and surprising development. And I think it's one that hopefully will unlock greater resources for the countries that are going to be most heavily impacted by climate change. If that proves true, I think it will be another example of how, and I sort of forgot to mention that as part of all this, there was kind of a coordinated effort on the part of the U.S. and its allies to kind of encourage this opposition to China. And so I think if it succeeds in doing something meaningful on loss and damage and adaptation financing, I think you could say that that kind of competition dynamic did have another positive outcome with respect to climate change.
Well, that points us to another question I wanted to get to before we wrap up here, because we are running short of time, which is you mentioned the importance of it's not just a US-China story, it's a global story, and other states matter as well. And you also mentioned India in the climate context. Well, India is sort of the other great developing country that is a tech power. So what is this dynamic that you're talking about in U.S.-China relations? What does it mean for India? Where does it play into this? Are there opportunities for India there? I know you were just in Delhi on talking about some of these issues.
Yeah, and I think one aspect of the growing rivalry and continuing deterioration of relations between China and the U.S. and other countries, and I do think it's worth emphasizing that it's not just U.S.-China relations that are deteriorating. It really is relations between China and almost every other major country in the world, including India. And so that one of the implications of that dynamic is that a lot of middle kind of powers are benefiting economically and geopolitically, in some cases militarily as well. The clearest examples of that are countries like Vietnam, but it's also tentatively true for India. And as you mentioned, I was just there. All the talk was of how India can seize the opportunity posed by this deterioration in U.S.-China relations and trade to its benefit. I do think there are problems with doing that. Just to kind of name a couple quickly, one is that I don't think any country will ever be able to match China's manufacturing economies of scale. Despite the outflow of the increasing outflow of foreign trade and investment, including in manufacturing. In fact, it's the case that, in areas like pharmaceutical precursors, where thanks to increasing restrictions on trade with China, U.S. suppliers and other suppliers are trying to turn to Indian alternatives. But the fact is they actually are Indian suppliers are dependent on Chinese suppliers further upstream in the supply chain. So it sort of quickly becomes absurd. So I think that there are real challenges to India kind of replacing China in any meaningful way in global supply chains. I think the other reality to contend with is that while at the moment U.S.-India relations are good to excellent, there do remain a lot of fundamental tensions that I think could easily disrupt those and could make it quite difficult for India to replace China, so to speak, politically and diplomatically, as well as economically.
Well, thanks. We've wrapped up right as we hit the top of the hour. Terrific discussion, wide-ranging set of topics. Again, the book is China's Next Act, How Sustainability and Technology Are Reshaping China's Rise and the World's Future. Our guest has been Scott Moore, the author of that book, of course, and a valued colleague here at Penn. I'm Jacques deLisle on behalf of the Foreign Policy Research Institute Asia program. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you'll join us for future programs on Zoom or as we get back to doing some on-site live programming as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.